Today, we journey back to the pinnacle of classical power, to Babylon in 323 BC, to stand at the bedside of a dying world. We are investigating the single most consequential death in ancient history, the sudden, bewildering collapse of Alexander the Great, not felled by a rival army on the field, but struck down in the heart of his own imperial court. This is the story of a forbidden secret that defined the century that followed, the possible imperial poisoning of Alexander, and the brutal, whispered politics that reshaped an entire world. Grab your coffee. We are decoding an ancient conspiracy that participants tried desperately to erase. At 32 years old, Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was a phenomenon. In little more than a decade, he had carved an empire stretching from the Greek mainland to the Indus Valley, shattering the Persian hegemony and remaking the political map of the known world. Plans for new campaigns farther into Arabia, perhaps even a circumnavigation of the known seas, were on his table. His personal charisma and unbroken streak of battlefield victories had become the political glue holding a fragile, sprawling imperial machine together. To many of his soldiers and subjects, he was divine. To many of his senior officers, he was an unpredictable autocrat whose ambitions endangered their status and lives. So when Alexander's health disastrously collapsed after a lavish banquet in Babylon, the consequences were immediate and seismic. The official record that would be preserved by later historians describes a 12-day illness. Fever, chills, crippling abdominal pain, progressive weakness, delirium, and finally, the inability to speak in his last hours. The convenient explanation, one that suited many who succeeded him, was natural disease, malaria, typhoid fever, or a cumulative collapse from years of wounds and excessive drinking. In short, an inevitable, tragic human death. But even from antiquity, the accounts carried odd details that jar modern readers and open the door for suspicion. Alexander was a man famed for his physical resilience and for sharing wine and cups freely with companions. The sudden onset of extreme abdominal torment following a boisterous feast is suspicious enough. More striking is a detail recorded in several sources and repeated by later chroniclers. Alexander's body reportedly remained uncorrupted, fresh. For 6 days after his death, a condition difficult to reconcile with a death from fever or bacterial infection in the intense heat of a Babylonian summer. To ancient observers and to modern skeptics alike, such a state implies either extraordinary preservation measures or the presence of a potent toxin that altered the normal course of decomposition. Enter modern forensic imagination. In 2014, Dr. Leo Shep, a toxicologist, proposed a candidate that attracted attention precisely because it fits the clinical outline the sources provide. Veratrum album, commonly known as white hellebore. This plant-based alkaloidal extract was known to ancient practitioners as a powerful emetic and irritant. When administered in specific ways, white hellebore produces violent gastrointestinal distress, intense abdominal pain, slow collapse of muscular strength, and protracted weakness symptoms that could be mistaken for a fever or severe illness. Perhaps most relevant to the ancient accounts, hellebore poisoning can produce a drawn-out dying process and does not necessarily leave obvious post-mortem signs in soft tissues that would be readily identifiable by the medical knowledge of the time. In short, it is a toxin that could mimic natural disease while concealing deliberate administration. If poisoning was the mechanism, the motive becomes easier and darker to understand. Alexander's inner circle, the powerful conglomerate of Macedonian generals and satraps later termed the Diadochi, had more to lose from his continued rule than almost any external power. He had increasingly acted on impulsive ideas, proclaiming divine honors, executing or humiliating those he perceived as disloyal, and planning risky campaigns that would have extended his reign but subjected his senior commanders to exhaustion or extermination. The question those commanders faced was existential. Remain loyal to the unpredictable king and risk annihilation, or remove him and seize control over a world-sized inheritance. Ancient rumor singled out Antipater, the regent back in Macedonia, as a central figure in the lethal intrigue. Antipater is known to history as a shrewd, cautious politician who felt the sting of Alexander's suspicion. Rumors held that Antipater, seeking to secure his own survival and influence, used a proxy, his son Iolaus, who served in Alexander's retinue as royal cupbearer, to introduce the fatal substance. The scenario is chillingly straightforward. A banquet, a cup, a trusted server positioned to mix a toxin into the drink under the cover of revelry. The banquet, hosted by Medeius of Larissa, which featured heavy drinking and celebration, becomes the perfect stage for both drunken excess and a premeditated act of regicide. Iolaus, as cupbearer, would have had intimate access to the royal drink and the perfect opportunity to conceal poison among the gaiety. We must not mistake plausible narrative for proven fact. Ancient sources are fragmentary, partisan, and often written centuries after the event. Yet conspiratorial interpretation fits other elements of the story. Alexander in his final days made no clear arrangements for succession. He left a vacuum. The immediate beneficiaries of that vacuum were precisely those who could most credibly arrange and cover up his death, the very generals who would later carve the empire into their own kingdoms. A cover-up was in their interest. To admit assassination would be to delegitimize the succeeding regime, to invite internecine suspicion, and perhaps to spark revolt among troops who idolized Alexander's almost sacred status. Painting the death as a fever or divine will allow the new rulers to consolidate power rapidly and to suppress inconvenient inquiries. The historical aftermath supports the effectiveness of that cover-up. Alexander's empire did not cohere. Instead, it fractured almost immediately into the wars of the Diadochi, a long, brutal struggle among his lieutenants for control of portions of the empire. Instead of a stable succession, the killers, whether active or passive conspirators, became kings in the chaos they had helped create. The supposed conspirators lived to profit. Satrapies and royal honors were parceled out, dynasties were founded, and the official narrative of a death by illness, rather than regicide, was propagated in histories that served the new order. There is a deeper counterfactual that hangs like a shadow over this story. If Alexander had lived only a handful more years, what might the world have looked like? Would he have unified administration, established a clear dynastic order, integrated Greek and Eastern institutions more harmoniously? Or would his further ambitions have produced yet more devastation? We cannot know. What we do know is that his death, suspicious and convenient in equal measure, unleashed a century of fragmentation that redrew the ancient world. So what should we conclude? The Veritrum album hypothesis is scientifically plausible and elegantly explains many of the odd ancient details. The political motive is undeniable and powerful. Yet definitive proof remains tantalizingly out of reach. The ancient record is a patchwork of rumor and retrospective justification. The silence and speed with which Alexander's death was normalized in official accounts may itself be taken as evidence of conspiracy or merely as the pragmatic politics of succession in a violent age. Whatever the truth, the poisoning theory endures because it satisfies a simple human intuition. Where power is absolute, those who profit from its end sometimes ensure that it ends quietly. The imperial murder of Alexander, if it occurred, is the oldest kind of political act, bloodless in appearance, bloody in consequence, and decisive in the sweep of subsequent history. Tell us in the comments. Does the Veritrum album theory close the case for assassination in your mind? Or do you think the mystery still yawns wide, leaving room for other explanations? Keep questioning everything.